Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for what is our fourth episode in a series of conversations about the civil society champions who are advancing human-centered innovation in tech and AI. The point of this series, for those of you who may just be joining us today for the first time or perhaps have tuned into a previous episode, is to really tell a new story about the vast potential of AI. And that's not a story that is rooted in techno-optimism or doomerism, but rather a story that celebrates and amplifies the needs, aspirations, and creative vision of communities across the globe. But we know that we can't tell this story with justice without pointing to the leadership and wisdom of civil society and nonprofits. So that's why the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, which for those of you who don't know, is a 21st century philanthropy leveraging AI and data science solutions to create a thriving, equitable, and sustainable future for all, is so committed to working in close partnership with these leaders, whom I'm very excited to introduce to you today. So I have the pleasure of speaking with Sara Woldehanna, who is the Director of Learning, Innovation, and Data Systems at Polaris, a nonprofit working to combat and prevent sex and labor trafficking across North America. In her role, she provides strategic leadership to a team that serves as a data analysis and learning hub for Polaris and the broader anti-trafficking field. And through operation of the National Human Trafficking Hotline, her team produces the largest data set on trafficking in the USA. She also helps initiate research that supports Polaris's work to dismantle systems that enable trafficking. Welcome, Sara. Thank you for joining us today. And I also have thanks, Sara. I also have the pleasure of welcoming Megan English, who is the Director of the Office of the President here at the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. She brings several years of experience supporting nonprofit partners who are looking to build and deploy AI for impact. And during her time at PJMF, she has developed a unique vision into the inner workings of a new kind of philanthropic partnership, one that better supports nonprofits like Polaris as they tackle considerable challenges and harness unforeseen opportunities to integrating data and AI into their work. And for those of you who don't know me, a quick background on myself. My name is Yolanda Bacciolo-DeVico, and I am the policy and advocacy lead at the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. I'm a human rights advocate, tech policy enthusiast, and writer who's focused on amplifying the stories, dreams, and aspirations of civil society and change makers, like Sara, who are working to empower communities across the globe. And Megan and I both have the distinct privilege of working with partners like Polaris, who are, through the testimony of their day-to-day work, are really actively demonstrating this alternative story about AI. And they're demonstrating the potential of nonprofits to leverage AI to not only advance their purpose, but to also begin to carve a broader space within the AI ecosystem as real drivers and leaders of AI for public good. But I'm sure the question that many of you have come to today's live stream with is, where and how can nonprofits begin on their journey of AI adoption? So this is a question that Sara actually began to unpack with the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation's President Vilas Dhar in a recent piece called Unlocking Opportunities, You'll Manage AI, Not the Other Way Around. And I encourage you all to read it in the December issue of the Nonprofit Times if you haven't yet. But in the piece, Sara and Vilas really discuss the real barriers and challenges that many nonprofits face when entering this space and when engaging with AI. And then they provide concrete steps on how to overcome those barriers, from getting more comfortable with failure and being able to pivot in your organizational strategy to really alleviating the growing pains within an organization when you are incorporating AI for the first time, or you're incorporating it again after a failure, if you will. So today I'm excited to discuss that piece a bit more in depth. as well as how Polaris is implementing these best practices and steps in their own efforts to stop human trafficking and empower survivors. But from Megan's perspective, the unique opportunities and resources that exist across the social impact space for nonprofits who are looking to get started. So without further ado, Sara, I'd love for you to provide a bit of context, even before we get into the piece of AI, into what Polaris is doing to fight human trafficking across North America to not only get individual survivors out of that vicious cycle, but also dismantle the systems that increase vulnerabilities to human trafficking.
Thank you so much, Yolanda. And before I start, thank you for the great introduction and also for the support that McGovern gives Polaris and all the nonprofits that are doing the kind of work that we'll be just talking about today. So just about human trafficking in general, it is a $150 billion global industry. It affects 28 million people who are forced or coerced into commercial sex or labor trafficking against their will. And then here in the US, the trafficking hotline identifies 10,000 situations of sex and labor trafficking per year. And those are just the situations we know about. Those are not the situations other hotlines might respond to, or people that just don't even show up and tell us about their exploitation. And traffickers exploit vulnerabilities like poverty, trauma, racism that just come from broken and biased systems. And so the people that are impacted usually are already marginalized. They're women, people of color, LGBTQ community, and just resource poor families. And then in addition to all of that, we also have distorted cultural narratives around trafficking that sensationalize the crime and divert attention and resources from survivor-centered solutions. So given this landscape, Polaris organizes our efforts under 3 program areas. The first one is direct response, where we help victims and survivors address immediate needs, including through the National Human Trafficking Hotline, and we connect them to local services, safety planning, and other supports. And then we also have the Resiliency Fund, which is a new program, which is a new guaranteed income pilot project, where we provide cash assistance and other resources to those who already exited their trafficking situation, but that they still need support. And then the other pillar of our work is research and intelligence, which is the area that I sit in. And in here, we generate information and actionable insights that drive a smarter response to trafficking across sectors. And in this program, there's 2 programs. The first is the data research team that I lead. And the second is the financial intelligence unit that uses the hotline data and open source information to develop intelligence packages for financial institutions and also law enforcement to help them disrupt situations of trafficking and also hold traffickers accountable. And then finally, Polaris also has a campaigns and public engagement component of our work, where we advocate and drive public policies to help build both equitable and just socioeconomic conditions. And this includes, so for instance, using our data for communication campaigns to promote accurate understanding of trafficking, and also to drive federal and state level policy engagement. So that's in a nutshell what Polaris does in this space.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Sara. And I think that piece, the work that you specifically do within the research and insights team, I think the power of AI as we know it is to take a large amount of information from disparate sources, to digest that information, to analyze it, and to really produce actionable insights. So I'd love to shift gears and actually talk about this role of AI in your work and relate it to the piece that you wrote with Vilas Dhar in the Nonprofit Times. So in the piece, you and Vilas talk about the potential of AI to maximize nonprofits' impact, and you provide sort of a blueprint on how to overcome these common barriers when integrating AI into your work. So I'd love to hear a little bit about what that journey has been like for Polaris and how you actually leverage AI in your day-to-day work.
Okay. So to tell that story better, I would like to get started about what we do with data at Polaris. So Polaris started operating the trafficking hotline in 2007. And then a few years in, we realized that there was a lack of data in the field. And we started looking through hotline case notes to generate the data to fill this gap. And then to do this, we set up a largely very manual but very rigorous and high quality process where we have data associates reading through case notes guided by very detailed data dictionary that sort of explores what trafficking experiences could look like. Then jump to year 2020, we have the number of calls that we received has more than doubled, including over a 4,000% increase in contacts directly from victims and survivors. Yet we still have a very largely manual process and a legacy system we used when we started our data journey a decade earlier. So this means there's an increasing lag in creating the hotline data that the field needs so much. It now takes us more than a year from when we first receive a call about a trafficking situation to when we complete a data set we can analyze for a particular month. So as you may imagine, this is far from ideal for our partners on the ground who need timely information to guide their work. So in the last few years, we've been struggling with the reality that our current processes will never be able to keep pace with the volume of information that we will keep getting, and with the increasing demand for the data from our partners. So come in AI. And so we see the potential of AI to improve our efficiency, but not just efficiency, to enable us to unearth new and predictive insights that we might not potentially be doing right now. And this really resonated, and that's where McGovern support was really, really essential. So we're still early in our journey, but we have taken our very first and critical step. We have piloted 2 AI tools in the last couple of years, and we're exploring how we can integrate them more comprehensively to speed up our hotline data creation. And we'll get into details of this a little bit later in our conversation. But what I want to talk about a little bit, though, is what we're excited about. We're excited about the impact that AI will help make possible. So I'll just mention a couple of just potential outcomes that we can see from this engagement. So for instance, service providers will have real-time data about trafficking situations in their own jurisdiction. I mean, right now we're able to provide, data about, trafficking situations across the states, but, as I said, a year down the line. But right now, maybe we would be able to provide this information on a timely basis. Law enforcement gets actionable intelligence to hold traffickers accountable quickly as well. And maybe corporations have industry-specific insights that enable them to mitigate trafficking risks within their own operations. So those are some of the things that we're really excited about the AI incorporation into our data ecosystem.
That's great. Thank you for that, Sara. That context is really helpful. I think it points to a common challenge, and that's the fact that a lot of these nonprofits are sitting on decades and a lot of data that is really useful and could provide some really helpful insights, but they don't necessarily have those cutting edge tools that we see within the private sector that can extract those insights and really apply them to their programs or how they advocate for new policies. So Megan, I want to bring it to you. And having worked across sort of a range of different nonprofits of different sizes across sectors, what are some of the critical considerations that organizations need to be aware of as they begin adopting AI, whether they're early on in their journey, like Sara mentioned about Polaris, or whether they're a little bit further along in their journey?
Yeah, thanks, Yolanda. And Sara, thank you for sharing all of that background. Thinking about these organizations, firstly, congratulations on thinking about starting this journey. As we've heard from Sara, it can be incredibly impactful and useful for all the work that you're doing. I think there are probably 3 bits that I would highlight. And I think starting organizationally, just ensuring you have strategic and executive buy-in, not only on what will this cost, what are the capacity needs, but really what are our realistic expectations for what's going to happen along the journey. What are the potential outcomes, and making sure everyone is on the same page, what's possible and what will it take to get there. And that's sort of for the organization. Secondly, I think just about technical capacity. Yolanda, you mentioned so many organizations have a lot of great data that they're sitting on. And I think we need to think about what is the quality of that data. As we know, training a model on poor quality data will yield poor outcomes. So what is the quality of that data? But also, do you have the technical expertise, whether in an advisory capacity or in-house, to really support you in your data maturity journey and in building this model and really implementing all of this technology? And then lastly, I think as we often talk about at the foundation, it all comes down to ethics. What are the mechanisms that you have in place for flagging any sort of ethical concerns, and what are the protection mechanisms you've put in place to say, is there any unintentional harm being done, whether to the intended beneficiary community or anyone else? So I think thinking about those three major points would be super helpful just to get started in thinking about this journey.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Megan. And that's really helpful. And it brings up another point that Sara and Vilas wrote about in the piece. And you talked about organizational buy-in and detecting these sort of ethical concerns and challenges along the way. So that brings me to the importance of transparent communication at every stage of AI integration. And that's transparent communication, not only at an organizational level, but with external stakeholders and certainly with the community that you're working with, to make sure that you're not causing any unintentional harm. So, Sara, I'd love to bring it to you and ask, how did Polaris approach sort of communicating these changes at either an organizational level, or if you'd like to talk about with the community you serve as well?
Okay. So I think, as Megan mentioned, just the organization piece is really, really important. AI brings both anxiety around implementation, job redundancy, but also sort of really unreasonable expectation about what can be achieved and how quickly, right? So we have to do a lot to manage both of these. So organizationally, we're very collaborative and clear about our intent from the start. We had to get buy-in from the executive team, which included making sure that they understood that AI was not a silver bullet and that it would also take time and resources to fully integrate it alongside human expertise. And then we also engaged the data associates that were working on, creating those data sets in the process of both innovating and imagining how AI could be used to improve efficiencies, and reiterated that their jobs are not in danger from AI. Instead, it could free them up to do more higher level work. We'll also engage with program teams to understand what kinds of data would be most helpful to them and to educate them about the kinds of data we could create and that we could analyze using AI or other tools. And across these conversations, just as Megan mentioned, we also have to make sure that we marry technology with our values, most notably being survivor-centered. For example, we considered using an AI chatbot on our hotline, but ended up implementing one that did not use AI, a technology that did not use AI, because the risk of an AI chatbot responding in unexpected or potentially harmful ways was not one that we could manage at this point in time. So we decided against that, but we did decide to use AI in other ways on our data processing process. And then as far as sharing it with external community stakeholders, we're not quite there yet, but we definitely see the need to do the same kind of nuanced data literacy education and communication once we've gotten further along the journey of revolutionizing our systems.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Sara. And you bring up a really critical piece with the idea of being survivor-centered and the way that you incorporate AI into your practices. And I want to come back to that. But before we do, I want to talk a little bit more about how this is a very collaborative process. This requires partnerships. This requires other sectors that work together with nonprofits to sort of fill in those gaps. So in the piece, you write about partnerships as a launching pad to success. And I think about the use of AI to write sort of a draft of midterm reports, or perhaps leveraging a platform like Beautiful.ai, which is super helpful for those of us who are not great at creating presentations, to help create a very visually pleasing presentation that showcases stories of success across your programmatic efforts. But I'm curious to know, when you're using AI in partnership with other folks, what are some of the best practices that you rely on, Sara, and other nonprofits can incorporate to really select the most relevant and mission-aligned partners to advance your work?
So as we started this journey, one thing we realized was that we could look at technology platforms we're already using and partners we're already working with, and explore how we can deepen our partnerships in ways that generated wins for both of us. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. In one case, we had a tech partner who had been giving us in-kind support for years, but we were not utilizing those resources to its best. We're underutilizing their platform. As we recently started communicating with them about our vision and not just our ongoing operations, we realized that they had a lot more to offer, and were able to have their employees volunteer, help us build a pilot by automating the first stages of our data creation. And their employees were very excited because they got a little bit closer to the way that their platforms were being used to impact, on the ground. And we got amazing transformational tools. In another case, we had been getting tons of credit from a technology partner, but we just did not use those credits because we didn't have the in-house capacity or the staff to be able to use them. And it was very frustrating, both for the technology partner and for us, not to be able to use them. So we're still working on this one, but we're entering a new phase of our partnership where more teams are involved, both my team, technology team, the corporate engagement team, where we're directly working with them to really understand what are the barriers to using their, what they're offering, and thinking much bigger and using their resources more effectively. And then finally, we were able to use one partner's technology platform to consolidate our hotline communication channels, both phone calls, text, web chats, and to make the experience so much better. So I think what I'm saying is like really just looking at what we have already, like the partners that you have, and thinking about engaging with them in a better way and more deeply is probably the first step I would take.
That's really helpful, Sara. Thank you for that. And I think, you mentioned some technical partners. Of the partners that jump to mind for me, working in the perspective of a philanthropy, and I'm sure the same for you, Megan, is the important role of philanthropy as a partner. And I think sometimes we see philanthropy as just a funding institution, but not necessarily an active partner. So, Megan, coming back to you, how can philanthropy or other institutions that have access to capital or even just other institutions of power, right? How can they build better relationships with nonprofits as real active and productive partners along their AI journey?
Yeah, sorry, you mentioned a perfect example, so I want to jump to that in a moment. But first, I think, just by the nature of our work, philanthropic organizations and also corporate foundations and institutions holding power have access to really broad networks of change makers across geographies, topic areas. And I think they are able to really, from a bird's eye view, identify opportunistic connections. And, that can really lead to synergistic efforts, improve global outcomes. But what we've seen at the foundation, even locally, but globally as well, there are a lot of organizations, really fantastic organizations, working on seemingly disparate problems, but they're actually affecting interconnected populations, and there are a lot of dependencies there. And so any technical implementation that one organization might be thinking about considering deploying may actually be really, really supportive and helpful and provide a major unlock for other relevant organizations. So I think from a philanthropic perspective and institution of, holding those connections, just identifying those and bringing organizations together in ways that they may be able to help each other. I think about quick example of an organization's providing shelter services and one providing food assistance. If we can deploy predictive analytics and demand forecasting, those organizations can actually help each other in thinking about what they will need for the year or several months ahead. So just thinking about how can we connect organizations. But coming back to Sara's point, capital contributors have a huge responsibility to not only contribute capital. We have expertise. You mentioned in-kind expertise and in-kind contributions that were shared. It just makes the funding go so much further. PJMF side, we have technical assistance and product development teams. And I'm thinking about corporate foundations as well that, you mentioned it, Sara, as well, thinking about employee engagement and community outcomes. People want to be involved. People want to support organizations that are doing the work. And so thinking about targeted programming and relevant opportunities core to a business's capabilities can be really helpful for nonprofit organizations trying to implement some of these technologies. So to come back to your question, Yolanda, I would say, thinking about ecosystem building, expertise sharing, but it all, again, coming back to my last comment, it all it's underlined by trust and sort of that ethical nature of operating.
That's great, Megan. Thank you. And I think you ended it on a perfect piece that it's all underlined by trust and ethical behaviors and ethical practices and ethical ways of partnering with both the organization that you're supporting, also the communities that they are serving. And I want to bring it back to something that Sara had mentioned that I very much agree with, the importance of being survivor-centered in your approach. So I come from a background in human rights advocacy. So I always think about this. And at the end of the day, any sort of humanitarian response or human rights advocacy, particularly human trafficking or anti-human trafficking, is very human work. It requires a good amount of empathy, of being able to listen without judgment, and of being able to provide deeply relevant support. And then on the other side, sort of recognizing the power of storytelling and being able to convey and do justice to these individual stories that can move policymakers to better support survivors and actively transform the systemic practices that not only increase vulnerabilities to trafficking, but also make it a lot harder for trafficking survivors to reintegrate into their families, into their communities, and into society writ large. So I'm curious as to how Polaris balances the human aspects of the technical, or the human aspect of the work that you do with the technical aspect of the work that you do. Specifically, you mentioned that AI is not a silver bullet. And in the piece, you say that not every problem should be solved with AI. So I'd love to hear from you. What kind of evaluation process do you actually go through to determine where and when AI has utility and where it's better to rely more on those human skills and tools?
That's such a great question. So I'm going to try to see like in so many different aspects of this, but like the first piece is, when thinking about these data sets and also engaging people with experience in creating the data and the research themselves. Like, so just starting from the very beginning, this helps in combating bias that could be amplified by using AI and specific data sets, and also ensuring that we're using AI to create relevant and actionable solutions for the situation. So first we have to understand the biases that are baked in our data. I think Megan really talked about that. And that, because for instance, in our case, the hotline is not fully representative, even though it is the stories of the people that are coming to the hotline, it is not fully representative of all individuals that are being trafficked. So really understanding that, and then knowing what our data, the underlying data can do, knowing what questions we can reliably pose to the model is also important. So then in that moment, engaging with survivors, with the community to really understand like what questions should we be asking this kind of model, what is relevant for the community, what is relevant for the actions that we want to take is important. So engaging survivors all along this process from the data creation all the way to sharing the stories and sharing the data, and how do we merge that with the stories of survivors is really important. And I think what I want to do is not talk about AI in this case, but really give you another example of what this process could look like. The best example for all of this is our recent national survivor study, in which we surveyed 457 survivors of trafficking in the US. And this was designed and completed in full partnership with survivors. So again, this is to sort of point that it's not just about how do we use the data at the back end, or how do we package the data with the stores in the back end, but how do we start that process from the very beginning? So this study was intended to help fill the hotline data gap by asking survivors directly questions that we don't always get to ask them when they're on the trafficking hotline, when they're calling the trafficking hotline, when they're asking for help. That's not the questions that we're asking. So instead, we decided to develop the study, but we did it instead of just the staff at Polaris doing it. We embedded survivor consultants in the team, and we also reached out to the community directly to ask, what should we be asking about? What are the questions that are really relevant? And if we had done it just within Polaris, we probably have been asking about vulnerabilities, which is what's really a very important topic to understand how trafficking should be tackled. But what we heard from the community was we also needed to understand what survivors need after they exited. At that point, nobody was asking those questions because our focus was really about dismantling the systems that enable trafficking. So because of that, we did the National Survivor Study, co-designed with survivors in full partnership, full leadership. And we were able to get data that really addressed their needs and also was able to provide very relevant data for the field. And in sharing that data, we also always collaborate with the survivors that helped build this data set, and they're able to bring more context and relevance to the data. So it's sort of a roundabout way of answering your question, but it really just sort of goes all the way from the very beginning to the end.
Yeah, and no, I appreciate that sort of explanation of what the experience is to actually speak with survivors of trafficking and work with them to create solutions that directly respond to their needs. And remembering that these are folks that have dreams and aspirations, and we're not always working to sort of dismantle the systems, but making sure that we're able to celebrate those aspirations and make sure they have a pathway to actually seek out opportunities that align with who they were before they experienced what they experienced, right? And I think that brings me to another point of this is a very iterative process. Maybe the first time you try to implement a piece of AI or an AI tool, it's not as effective and you have to sort of take a step back, figure out what went wrong and pivot, right? And Megan, I'm going to come to you and ask, how can foundations better support this growth and learning journey? And how can they actually make space for failures and pivots in both their internal and external AI strategy?
Yeah, I think coming back to your point, Yolanda, the human aspect is key, right? And Sara, your example just totally really underlines that. But first, I'll say not all problems need an AI intervention, full stop. But for those that do, there's likely going to be a significant learning curve, particularly for interventions that are technical or new to organizations. So I think starting with in a place of honesty and building that trust between nonprofits and the philanthropies that they work with, that trust has to be built, but having that baseline is super important. And the way I think about, your question, how can we provide space for failures and pivots? How can we rethink philanthropic investment and really think about what is our risk tolerance? I think if we think about philanthropic capital as investment dollars, some investments fail pretty terribly despite due diligence looking really, really good. And some have significant promise and have life-changing returns. I think the majority of them fall in the middle. So I think, if we're thinking about incentivizing approaches to progress, we need to have that tolerance to say this might fail and that's okay. We're going to help try to figure out how to reroute, get back on track. And I think a part of that is really coming back to a point that was made a little bit earlier, is bringing in technical expertise. As a funder, if you're looking at an organization saying, we're excited to fund this AI implementation at this organization, but we know there is a capacity gap, how can we help organizations with some sort of assistance, whether it's tech capacity or advisory services, to say, hey, we know that there is a gap. Let's help you bridge that gap so that your project, your outcomes are as successful as they can be. And I think, again, coming back to the trust point, there is a power dynamic. And I think really challenging that perception of the power dynamic is super important. I recall a few instances with partners that we've worked with where we've had really big plans at the beginning of the year, let's say, and they've come back to us and said, things are a little off track. It's not going the way that we wanted it to go. And instead of, hesitating to say that the investment's off track, it's not working, asking for help and rescoping is really the way that we are going to collectively make progress. So I think really considering what is your risk tolerance as a philanthropy, and supporting and incentivizing collaboration and trust building on both sides is super important.
Thank you, Megan. That's great. I like this idea of collectively making progress and understanding that we all have common goals. We all want to see a better world. We all want to see more ethical practices. We all want to see a more equitable society, right? So before I get to the last sort of tranche of questions that I have for today, I do want to invite folks to share your questions in the chat. We'll come to those shortly, and really excited to hear from everyone in the audience. But my last set of questions is sort of around something that we should always be considering. You both have mentioned it a couple of times in passing, but how we can't have this conversation around using AI for a social impact purpose without having a discussion around ethics and safety. And of course, at the end of the day, we often say at the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, I'm sure many of you, if you've followed our president's speaking engagements, he often says that we're not talking about ethical technologies. We're talking about the more important piece here, which is ethical organizations and ethical institutions and an ethical society writ large that will make sure that we're really using applying these technologies in ways that support communities at the end of the day and protect their privacy and safety, and really iterating and changing course as needed to ensure that our mission and purpose remain the priority. So I wonder, Sara, if you could talk about what internal and external safeguards Polaris has deployed as an organization to preserve both the privacy and safety of trafficking survivors as they are integrating AI into their work.
Okay. So I think, like you said, it's about sort of the way we approach everything, right? Like, so it's not just about AI. I think AI brings a new set of considerations, a new set of challenges to solve. But at the end of the day, it really is about all data. How do we, how do we secure the privacy and data of the people that, that come to us? And so that's about the cybersecurity to store our data, and also really having very strict data sharing guidelines. For instance, we do not share non-anonymized data with anyone. And even when we share aggregate data, we do not share it if we think that it might expose someone to their privacy being exposed. So for instance, we don't share data on localities of less than 50,000, or if there's like in a certain locality, there's only like 3 trafficking situations, then you might be able to identify someone. So regardless of whether it's AI or not, we take those types of considerations. But then when we are thinking about ethics, we also think about, are we compensating survivors who helped create the data and analyze the data too? So for instance, in the National Survivor Study, we're very, very intentional about how we compensate survivors, both who take the survey, who worked with us. So that's another ethics that's really important to consider. And then another thing that we might overlook is considering what different stakeholders might do with the information that we generate. This is including any tool or including AI. So one danger of building AI is models is if people don't understand what it's based on. I think we've been saying this throughout this conversation. People might misuse it, might not really understand what the resulting information is. So education is really, really critical. Like educating people about like, what does this data or this information say based on what data actually went into it. And then I want to give you an example that sort of touches on some of this experimentation piece that Megan was talking about, and just give you a little bit of a peek into some of the experimentation that we were doing, and sort of, you'll see when, how that sort of ties back to how we really think about this very carefully when we roll out a tool. So one of the projects that McGovern sort of supported us with was creating this one tool. And what we did is data associates, for instance, read the cases, and they create that the cases, the data that we share with the field. And one of the things that they were supposed to tag each case with a keyword for future analysis. But this particular process was not being implemented very consistently across the board. So when we first started looking at solving problems, we started thinking about replicating the existing process using AI to automatically tag cases with our keywords. But we realized very quickly that this is sort of a failure, a type of failure, because we realized that these keywords were not going to help us solve new and emerging issues. For instance, when COVID happened, we were asked to share insights about the impact of the pandemic on victims, but our keyword system was not equipped to answer the question. Like, there was no COVID, pre-2020. So it was in this failure and continued experimentation, we realized the potential for a very different tool. So we built a dynamic and flexible search tool using natural language processing, where we can search for any text in our case notes. And so we could search for text like H-2A visa, COVID, which dramatically expanded our ability to research emerging and evolving issues. But what this also did was we were thinking, okay, now we're going to deploy this tool across the organization. All of a sudden, we realized, wow, we're actually going to expose our data set to people that are not educated. And all of a sudden, raw data was going to become available. And so we actually held back in deploying this tool. So those are the kinds of considerations that there are successes. But then even in your successes, you have to sort of step back and say, okay, is this really a tool that I'm ready to deploy right now? Do we need to do some education? Do we need to do some safeguarding around this?
Yeah, and I think that that's so critical, because it gets to how this is such a holistic process of like not just building a tool that is influenced by the wisdom that in the data that you've gained over the years, but also making sure that you are deploying that tool in a way that is responsible and actually actually serving the communities. And if right now you don't have that infrastructure, that foundation for that tool to be as effective as possible, you can hold off, and that's okay. And I think that's a great point to be aware of, being really self-aware of where you're at in your deployment process. And Megan, I wonder if I could come to you for sort of a final point before we get to audience questions, because I'm seeing some great questions come in. But I wonder if you could also speak to the broader mechanisms on a sectoral level that can support other nonprofits to build more secure data systems and to use both data and AI more ethically.
Yeah, and in thinking about maybe the audience that has come to this conversation today, I think many are at the very beginning of their journeys. And so I want to start by saying you are not alone. There are partnerships available. There are organizations that are leading on this work that can help you to do this. And I think, Sara, your example of, particularly for organizations like Polaris, there's such highly sensitive data that an internal commitment to data governance, thinking about how we collect and store data, how data is or is not shared is super important. And I think there's also it requires a robust understanding of policies and laws and norms, and how organizations can protect that vulnerable and sensitive data. I could go on about the number of partners that we work with that are leading on some of this work, but I think to the group in the audience today, what I'd like to just share is that there are organizations out there that are leading on this work and eager to help organizations at the very beginning of their journeys, so that as much as this seems like a mountain, it is completely doable. And so I would definitely suggest and recommend that people start reaching out and looking for those opportunities.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Megan. And thank you, Sara. I want to get to the audience questions. So here's a great one in the chat. Posing an intersectional lens on this conversation, certain populations are at much higher risk of being trafficked, especially populations on the move, refugees or undocumented immigrants, survivors of domestic and gender-based violence, etc. How has AI helped your team to better detect these higher risk populations, if so? And what kinds of mechanisms do you have in place for prevention and support?
So as I mentioned, we are very, very early in our AI journey, but we have sort of, I can talk a little bit to the potential for what this has been able to do for us. So I'll just go back to that case note search tool that I mentioned earlier. So because of that case note search tool, we typically get a lot of requests from media and program about whether some trafficking narrative is right, whether there's some truth to something. So in this case, we got a request asking us about whether social media posts about abduction of white vans was really common way for people to get trafficked. Before, it would have taken us several months and many staff to answer this, but just in a few hours, really literally hours, we're able to find the answer, which is only 6% of likely victims were recruited through abduction. And this was the second least referenced form of recruitment. And only 0.04%, listen to this, 0.04% of victims were abducted by a white van. Now, this might seem sort of like, well, we just sort of put down a false narrative, but it's really, really critical because people make unfounded calls to the trafficking hotline about sensational tactics, and this diverts time and resources better spent on helping victims. And it also, more importantly, it diverts attention away from the fact that trafficking most often happens through someone the victim knows. So this is where AI was really like in real time able to help us put down a narrative that then is able to translate back into the real world.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Sara. That's really helpful. And then this next question is for both Sara and Megan. So I'll break it up into two. So in any sort of humanitarian response or advocacy work, the siloed nature of institutions presents a major barrier to success. I would agree with that. For Sara, how has Polaris worked to overcome these silos across social workers, law enforcement, policymakers, legal aid, etc.? And I'll come to Megan next. We'll start with that first question.
Okay, so for us, I think what we have done is build a model for how this kind of collaboration can happen. And we're still in this early journey. this is definitely where this model can take us further. So, but in the first model, we are bringing in the data quality associates, we're bringing in hotline staff, we're bringing in program people that are thinking about how to implement the project, we're bringing in survivors, we're bringing in pretty much everybody that we work with to come to the table to build the solutions. And that's why it's very, very impactful. So we're breaking silos within the organizations right now, and also bringing in the partners externally, the tech partners that I mentioned before, to come to the table to say, like, what solutions can happen when we're thinking outside the box. So we're hoping that we can take this approach as we're building and expanding our work in this space.
That's great. Thank you, Sara. And I think that also brings up a good point, because when you're considering breaking down silos, we think of silos more broadly within society, across sectors, across geographies. But it's also important to break down our organizational silos and make sure that we're all working together towards a common vision. Megan, to you, what capabilities has AI shown in enabling more collaboration across silos and sectors?
Yeah, I'm actually, to this question, I'm thinking a bit about some of our partners that Sara, I know that you work with as well, Stop the Traffic and Allies Against Slavery, who are really building out platforms, leveraging data coming in from all sorts of jurisdictions, also survivors coming in from all different law enforcement agencies around the world to start identifying patterns and really begin to respond before the problem presents itself, and really try to focus on that preventative nature. So I think, Yolanda, to the question, AI is really a tool that we have to prevent rather than respond. And I think organizations, particularly in the anti-trafficking space, have really started to leverage that capability and all of the data that exists in so many disparate places to start to work on prevention or continue to work on prevention.
Thank you for that, Megan. And then we have a couple more questions, I think time for a couple more questions in the chat. But this question is, how do you help overcome any hesitancy in utilizing AI for organization staff members or the communities they serve? I guess it gets back to that trust piece, right? So whichever one of you would like to take it, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think from our end, I mentioned a little bit about just sort of managing expectations and being very transparent about the fact that this is an experimentation, and not all things that we experiment with is gonna succeed. And in the failure is where we might actually come up with a really good solution. And sort of the transparency piece is really, really critical, and just sort of like creating a culture of experimentation is really important too. Then people can actually see, here is an idea that we came up with, and here's how we were able to transform the way we work, and maybe our job shifted a little bit, and it's actually really important, and that we learned and we failed, and when we moved to a different solution. I think sort of both culture and transparency, and just the intention that we're not going to create the best solution tomorrow. It's gonna iterate.
Mm-hmm. I think that's it. That's a great point. Megan, do you have anything to add?
The only thing I'd add is sort of thinking back to Sara's example of how the Polaris began to implement in the very, very beginning. I think that was a great case study in how to do this well.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you both. And I think we probably have time for one more question before I get to sort of closing remarks. And I will come to both of you for a call to action. So start thinking about that. But this last question is, how does PJMF assess the ethics of the AI interventions that it supports? And what kind of tools have been helpful for us in our due diligence and monitoring? Megan, do you want to take that?
I can take a bit of that, yeah. A big question. We have, in thinking about the 200 plus partners we work with, all of the partners are at very different stages along their data maturity journey, their AI implementation journeys. And so it's hard to answer the question, specifically to specific, tools, et cetera. But I think the way that we think about it is, where is the organization today? Where are they seeking to go? How can we support and make sure that their approach, that all of the stakeholders relevant to this organization, relevant to this effort, are bought in? And I think we do really maintain close relationships with, and Sara, you can speak to this, with the organizations we work with. So it's not a, sort of we come in and we look at the organization and we say, hey, this looks good, and walk away. We want to be partners beyond funding. We need to be partners to make sure that this journey is sustainable. And I think that is the way that we sort of, through that relationship and that trust building, ensure that those ethical standards remain in place.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan. And I don't know if you have anything you want to add, Sara. I mean, I know you probably engage in a lot of ethics assessments within your own organization.
I think what I mentioned earlier, like really thinking through how's this data, how's this tool going to be used? Like, what's the so what behind it? Not just like, oh, so interesting and it's so good. And just like, how's it going to impact the people that we aim to serve is sort of the way we go about doing it as well.
Awesome. Thank you both. And thank you to the audience members who asked those excellent questions. I'm sure we could stay here all day asking more questions, but definitely want to be mindful of everyone's time. And I'd love to come to sort of a closing word. And when we think about integrating AI into our social impact work, we've gotten a lot of things to think about here today, from the ethical concerns to building trust to figuring out when perhaps AI is not the best approach and when it could really advance your programmatic efforts. So I love to take it. Let's go with Megan first and then Sara for a closing word. What is one call to action that you would give to our audience members here today who want to take this journey and may not know where to start?
Yeah, be bold. It's a learning journey for everyone. I think AI has certainly entered, it's on scene at the moment. I think many of us have had a sort of preview of it, and there are many people thinking it around, Silicon Valley and big tech that are very, very involved in it. But we have just as much in the nonprofit space, the social sector, just as much need to be involved in this conversation and in building these tools. So step into it, be bold, and reach out when you need help.
Thank you, Megan. Go ahead, Sara.
I would love to use Megan's be bold. Actually, the right one, because I think AI has the power to unlock so much. But I think it's about being bold and being very thoughtful. Again, going back to that thing that not everything is going to be solved by AI, but there's a lot that can be done. I mean, we have a lot of vision about using AI to, make data information available so that it's impactful beyond trafficking space. Like, we are imagining what if housing providers or child welfare professionals could better tailor their programs and resources so that people are prevented from being trafficked in the first place? Or what about social media platforms could develop better indicators so that they can actually catch would-be predators? Or what if cities could use the data to create policies and programs that protect the most vulnerable? So, really be bold, be thoughtful is, I think, the way to go.
That's awesome. Thank you both. This has been so enlightening. Sara, I want to ask you, how can listeners stay updated on your work?
So go to our website, polarisproject.org, to learn more about our work and sign up for email updates. We do send a lot of really good emails. And you can also follow us on social media. On LinkedIn, it's linkedin.com company Polaris-Project. On Facebook, it's at Polaris Project, and Twitter as well. We have a Twitter account at Polaris_project.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sara and Megan, for your incredible insights. This has been very uplifting, and I think we're all sort of motivated to get started on our own AI journeys. And really just thank you for your overall dedication to a world where AI is really built and deployed in service of communities, with communities in the driver's seat. I think that's an important piece that we talked about today. So thank you to our audience as well. We really appreciate you tuning in. I'd like to also share a quick promo for our next episode, so stick around to see that. But in the series of AI talks, it'll air on Friday, March 1st at 12 p.m. Eastern time. It'll be moderated by our foundation president, Vilas Dhar, and it'll focus on celebrating genius potential and the ways in which we are already seeing young Black tech experts and enthusiasts lead the way into a better tomorrow. So more to come on that soon, but please feel free to register at the link, which will be provided in the chat, and we will see you next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Samantha and Megan. It was great.
Thank you, Sara.
Thanks.